Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. I heartily welcome all evening batches, right? Good evening, everyone. I heartily welcome all evening batches today, right? Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good evening, right? Now, from today onwards, as you know that the institution has set up a new set of timetables for you, and you're going to have two GS classes back to back. One will be from 7 to 9, and I think the one that you would have already had a GS class before this, right? So my class will be from 7 to 9 every day until your polity course is over. So we'll keep it in such a way, and I think 2 hours is a good time because we are in an online medium, so we are only going to be focusing on substantive elements, and that will anyways let us cover more ground with sufficient amount of detail and with a lot of multimedia inputs, and ensure that you are able to get a good learning experience. And a lot of you may also have some optional subjects and CSAT and other commitments, so you should be able to manage with the multitude of classes that are going to be with you. Now, in yesterday's class, we were lucky enough to get an additional class yesterday, where we were able to discuss exactly what the layout of our theme 3 is going to be, and we through an analogy understood exactly what rights, directive principles and fundamental duties are. Now we are going to spend some time today, and we are going to cover the layer 1 part, which is conceptual and factual in nature, and therefore is important as far as prelims is concerned. Now, before I begin with this part, I must also make you very clearly and very categorically understand, right? Yeah, very clearly and very categorically understand that there are essentially three truths in life. There is your truth, there is my truth, and there is, of course, the truth of the Union Public Services Commission. And as far as you and I are concerned, your truth and my truth don't matter. What matters is what is absolutely right as per UPSC. And how do we know what is right as per UPSC? We know what is right as per UPSC in terms of the answer keys that they release with respect to the questions that they ask as far as the prelims is concerned. So outside the UPSC domain, a lot of the conclusions that we will draw may not be absolutely correct, but as far as they are correct as per UPSC standards, that is all that matters, because that is going to get us the marks that we so desirably need, right? So we will remember that. We will always keep that into account. Okay, right? Is my voice low? My voice seems to be quite okay, as I can see from uh, the voice indicator here. It seems to be quite okay, but just in case, I think the tech team will quickly check and tell you whether it is okay or not, right? They will tell you, don't worry. They'll post this in the comment box. Okay, so let us start. So what we're going to be studying basically are the features of fundamental rights, directive principles, and fundamental duties. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at each feature, and we'll understand them through the notions of rights, directive principles, and duties. Okay? Now, let us start. I hope you've also read what we were supposed to discuss today, and you've come to class with a little bit of reading of the notes that were already given to you. Okay? All right. So let us start. So the first idea is we're going to write fundamental rights. We're going to write directive principles of state policy, and then we are going to write fundamental duties. Fundamental rights, directive principles of state policy, and fundamental duties. Remember, our primary focus here is to get maximum questions right in the prelims while developing a certain degree of conceptual clarity. Okay? Now, the first set of features that we're going to talk about relate to the origin of these very specific rights. Now, I will speak about this and I will talk to you about this in a fair amount of detail. Now, when we say the origin, now please understand this. What do we mean by origin? It means when we were developing our constitution in the 40s, when the Constituent Assembly was spending some time arguing about positions, arguing about provisions, having a detailed discussion about what are the kind of articles that we must include in the constitution, we must also understand that a lot of the world had already developed. Yes, you have. Yes, a lot of it was already developed in a lot of the other parts. A lot of the other parts of the world. The world, several countries of the world had developed constitutions. So when we say origin, what we mean here is what is the corresponding constitution as per the Constituent Assembly debates, which mention that that specific set of provisions were taken from, right? So it's not about if there are any other constitutions which also talk about it. Like for example, there are several constitutions in the world where fundamental rights are mentioned in some capacity. But we are not referring to all the constitutions. We are referring to the constitution which originated this idea, and we've taken it from that specific constitution. And this is largely a very prelims centric discussion. So, as far as fundamental rights are concerned, we have borrowed our fundamental rights from the US Constitution. I'm sure all of you would have heard of something called the Bill of Rights. You would have heard of something called the Bill of Rights. So we have actually borrowed our fundamental rights from the US Constitution, which is the Bill of Rights. Okay, so that's the one part. Nothing beyond this is important. In the analytical discussions, we'll get into a comparative constitutional idea. But as far as layer 1 is concerned, this is more than enough. If the prelims question asks you from which of the following have fundamental rights been borrowed, your answer without batting an eyelid will be the US Constitution, which is also the Bill of Rights. Then we look at directive principles of state policy. Now there are two answers to this. The answer that we know and we will always mark as correct is that we've borrowed our directive principle from the Constitution of Ireland or the Irish Constitution, okay, or the Irish Constitution, right? There are several provisions from the Irish Constitution that are actually, ingrained in our Constitution, and there are detailed discussions about it, but you don't worry about that. What we need to worry about is where have we taken our directive principles from. But interestingly, Ireland had borrowed it from the Constitution of Spain or the Spanish Constitution. But if the UPSC asks us this question in the prelims, we will mark Ireland as the correct answer because we've borrowed our directive principles from the Constitution of Ireland. Okay, we've borrowed our directive principles from the Constitution of Ireland, and that is something that we have to unquestionably be okay with. We have to unquestionably agree with. Okay, good. Now, when it comes to fundamental duties, now sometimes in the mains you may also be writing about fundamental duties to explain an idea or to explain what citizens should be like. And this is where a lot of people make a mistake. We were discussing this yesterday, that fundamental duties were added through the 42nd Constitutional Amendment of 1976. Fundamental duties were added through the 42nd Constitutional Amendment of 1976, which means we are talking about a country that existed around the same time. So in 1976, there was nothing called Russia. What we had was USSR, or you could call it the former Soviet Union. Former USSR is also okay. Former Soviet Union is also okay. This is the technically correct usage because Russia only existed after the only existed after the disintegration of USSR. Right, Ajay, I can choose to look wherever I want to, and the reason I keep looking towards the left is because I have the system on the left, so that I can keep an eye as to whether the audio is fine, the video is fine, in case you are giving any comments that I need to inculcate in the discussion of the class. So it doesn't matter where I look, what matters is what I'm saying. This is not a theatre performance. I'm not here dancing in front of you. I'm here educating you about something or the other. And of course, I will try to look into the camera as much as possible, but this is largely how we go about it. All right? Okay. So, the fundamental rights, directive principles, and fundamental duties were respectively taken from the US Constitution, which is the Bill of Rights. The directive principles were taken from the Irish Constitution, and fundamental duties were taken from the Soviet Union Constitution, or the USSR, as we would know about this. All right? Okay? Right. Now, for those of you who are asking me, sir, we've already covered this. I don't think you attended yesterday's class, where I made it categorically clear that we are starting from theme 3 because several students were not able to attend theme 3 in their physical classes because of the pandemic, because of certain health restrictions. So if you've already attended this and you can better make use of your time, you don't have to attend the live class. You've already covered this. But if you want to, you can feel free to go through this again. This is something which is a privilege which has been accorded to you, so you can choose to do this or not, because there are all evening batches which are a part of this series of classes in the evenings. All right, so this is primarily what is called as the origin, right? Now that we understand what are origins, what do they come from, where have they been taken from, let's get into right. So let's take into the other elements. Today's class, I don't understand why are you guys asking me the same question again and again, which I have already covered, yesterday. We are going to be discussing layer 1 of theme 3 today. So if layer 1 of theme 3 has been covered for you, great, don't attend today's class. If it hasn't been covered for you, then you can attend today's class. If you want to redo the theme again, redo layer 1 again, you can attend class. And please maintain the sanctity and the decorum of the class. Okay? Alright? Okay. The L6 batch would have also been a part of this. I'm sorry if the L6 batch was not informed about this. I am informing you again, my apologies, that we are starting from theme 3. If you've covered, the agenda today is to cover layer 1 of theme 3. So if you've already covered this, you can choose to attend the subsequent classes, and if you haven't, then you can continue doing this again, right? N batch, Raksham and everybody else, there is one topic left in citizenship, which we're going to take an extra 1 hour class tomorrow and cover that. So relax. I know what has been covered and what has not been covered, right? So don't worry. Please study what is being taught to you at the moment. All right. Anyways, so this is very clear. We understand primarily what your origins are, right? Now, once we understand what our origins are, let's get into the other forms of discussion. Let's get into certain, what is called the specificities of it. All right. So let us start and let's get this right. Okay. All right. We are now going to talk about obligations. And these are standard prelims questions, and therefore they become important. We're going to talk about something called obligations, and by extension, we're also going to talk about something called correlations. Okay? Obligations and correlations. So let's understand what it is that we are referring to. Okay? First, when we talk about obligations, we're going to first demarcate fundamental rights, directive principles of state policy, and fundamental duties. Now, when we talk about obligations, when we talk about who are these rights, essentially regulating? Let's understand this. We're going to look at two kinds of obligations. Obligations on the state and obligations on the people. Obligations on the state and obligations on the people, or obligation towards the people, right? Now, as far as fundamental rights are concerned, they are largely negative obligations on the state. They are largely negative obligations on the state, which means the government cannot violate any of these fundamental rights which are available for you in your capacity to make your lives better, right? Negative obligations on the state. Okay, simple as that. Now, as far as the people is concerned, now this is where you must get it right. Now, if you see in your notes, I have categorically given that as far as obligations on the people is concerned, fundamental rights are generally positive in nature. That people are allowed to set up linguistic minority institutions, religious minority institutions. So in that sense, there are some positivities which are attached to fundamental rights. But fundamental rights per se are not for the people. They are to regulate government action. They are primarily to regulate government action, and through these fundamental rights, we are guaranteeing that if people want to set up religious institutions, minority institutions, linguistic institutions, the state is not going to stop them. The state is not going to prevent them. In fact, the state is supposed to support them. So that is what is primarily meant by the obligations on the people. Alright, so that is something you must know. Now, let us talk about obligations as far as directive principles and fundamental duties are concerned. Obligations as far as directive principles and fundamental duties are concerned. Now, directive principles, again, we have obligations on the state and you have obligations on the people. We will do this in technical detail, so don't worry. The first thing you must understand is directive principles are not compulsory. We'll cover the details of this in the context of legal status. We'll cover that in just a bit. But the larger discussion that we are trying to have here is that who is the directive principle for? Who is supposed to implement directive principles if they want to? Then the answer to that is, of course, the state. The answer to that is, of course, the state, right? Now, there are certain things that the state has to do positively. There are certain things that the state has to do negatively. Like, for example, the state must promote cottage industries. That, in a sense, is a positive directive principle. But the state must also try to, impose prohibition on liquor consumption. Now, that is a negative directive principle, right? And I'm going to tell you exactly how this is asked in the prelims. So don't worry about it. So as far as the state is concerned, it is both positive and negative to a very strong extent, right? And of course, it has absolutely nothing to do with the people. You must understand the Constitution is primarily a document regulating the government. It very rarely has anything to do with the people. And whatever it tells us as citizens to do, it does not compulsorize it. It does not make it necessary for us to do what we have to do, right? So that is something we must know, right? So that is why now we look at fundamental duties. As far as fundamental duties are concerned, we're having a deeper discussion. They have absolutely nothing to do with the state. It is for us as people to, do. It is for us as people to, follow and make relevant changes in our lives. But when we look at the obligations that fundamental duties can have for us people, they are usually positive in nature. They encourage us to do something. say to develop scientific temper, humanism, spirit of inquiry, to value and cherish the ideals of the freedom struggle, right? To live in harmony for that matter. So these are things that we are supposed to do. We are supposed to condemn violence. We are supposed to live in peace and harmony. So largely, fundamental duties tend to be positive obligations on the people. Now comes the tough part. The tough part is if something is both positive and negative, and if it comes in the exam, what are we going to mark as our correct answers? This is why you must understand this clearly. I am going to give you a certain set of statements, and only those statements are going to be correct as far as the prelims is concerned. Only and only those statements are going to be correct as far as prelims is concerned. So the academic discussion here, you can argue both ways. But remember, there is only and only one truth that matters, and that is the truth of the UPSC as to what UPSC thinks the correct answer to be. Right? So we'll get to that and let's understand this. So, what are our final concluding statements? What are our final concluding statements as far as obligations are concerned? These are the only statements that you will refer to as far as the exam is concerned. If this statement is not mentioned, then it does not matter. Okay, so let us start. Statement number 1. Fundamental rights are negative obligations on the state. Fundamental rights are negative obligations on the state. This is correct. If the option says fundamental rights are positive obligations on the state, incorrect option. Incorrect at all. Okay? Fundamental rights are negative obligations on the state. It's that simple. Okay? Now, you will never get a question on a prelims option that will say, what are the fundamental rights obligations on the people? This is because of two reasons. Because, and we will discuss this, there are 3 fundamental rights which are enforceable not only against the state but also against private individuals or corporations or institutions. So that means there is some form of negative obligation on private individuals also, on private citizens also, right? So that is why it is important. I am giving you the final outcome. Please, Anupam, please pay attention to the damn board. Okay, and please stop commenting in the middle of the class. Let me focus on delivering it. There are more than 2,000 students right now in class. I am not going to attend to each comment in the middle of the class. Maintain the decorum of the class. This is not a private tuition center. Okay, so as far as fundamental rights and obligations of them on the people are concerned, you will not get this question in the prelims exam because there is no defined answer to this. But in the rare chance that you do, and it says, you know what, fundamental rights are positive obligations on the people, and if it says fundamental rights are negative obligations on the people, you will mark positive. Why? Because the negative obligations are never just through the fundamental rights. It is through any other law which is being made to support fundamental rights. So for example, untouchability is a right which is available against people as well. But that right is actually implemented through the Prevention of Atrocities Against SC/ST Act. So that is outside the scope of the Constitution. That is a separate law, which is why in the rare chance that you get a question which says fundamental rights are positive obligations, you will mark that as correct. If it is negative, you will mark that as incorrect. Okay? Important. Now comes the second concluding statement. As far as directive principles of state policies are concerned, you will mark the correct answer as both positive and negative on the state. It has absolutely no obligations, no obligations on the people. It has absolutely no obligations on the people. Extremely important. No obligations on the people, has nothing to do with the citizens of India, the people of India. All right. And then as far as fundamental duties are concerned, again very clear and very categorical. Fundamental duties have no obligation on the state, but the same logic as fundamental rights. We will mark positive fundamental duties as the correct option, and we will mark negative fundamental duties as the incorrect option, because the government will have to make a specific law either criminalizing it or either suspending it in the larger domain. So these are basically your obligations as far as your rights, duties and directive principles are concerned. Okay, very important. Now, as simple as that. Now we come to correlation. Now we come to correlation. Okay, correlation, simple correlation. Okay, now what is meant by correlation? In maths you would have studied, if x and y are correlated, then a change in y can have an effect on x, or a change in x can affect on y. So these are correlative to each other, right? These are correlative to each other. Okay, now in the notes I have very clearly told you independent variables, but I am going to only and only give you as far as the prelims exam is concerned. If you get a question, are they correlative to each other? The answer is a very simple one. Fundamental rights, directive principles of state policy and fundamental duties are correlative to each other. That means a change here can have a change here, can also have a change here. I'll give you this with a clear demonstrative example. The only constitutional amendment in the history of this country which through the same amendment amended all the three together in the same manner till date is the 86th amendment. I'll repeat this again. The 86th constitutional amendment is the only amendment in the history of this country which through the same amendment has amended rights, directive principles and fundamental duties. Okay, so what did it do? It added Article 21A to the Constitution as the fundamental right on education and said that 6 to 14-year-olds should be given free and should be given compulsory education according to a law which will be made by the Parliament. Okay, this is the essence of Article 21A. Now, directive principles of state policy already had mentioned that the government should try and give education to 6 to 14 years of age. Now, the same thing cannot be a directive principle and cannot be a fundamental right, because fundamental rights are compulsory and directive principles are not. So on one hand, you can't say that the government has to make sure every 6 to 14-year-old gets education, and on the other hand, in directive principles, you can't say that if possible, whenever the government has the will, the resources and the need, they can provide for education to 6 to 14-year-olds. One can't be compulsory and optional at the same time, right? So you had to amend directive principles, and instead of 6 to 14, you had to then replace it with 0 to 6. So this is in our directive principles today. And because this fundamental right is only available against the state and there is no action against the parent if the parent does not send the child to school. We've discussed this in one or two classes of governance that I had taken for you, which means that we have to encourage our parents to ensure that they send the children of our country to school. So the latest fundamental right under Article 51, the latest one, I think subclause K, mentions that the parents must encourage opportunities for children between 6 to 14 years of age to be able to go to school. So they become complementary. So if in the prelims exam you get a question as to the correlation between the three, your answer will be an astounding yes. That yes, fundamental rights, directive principles of state policy, and fundamental duties. Fundamental rights, directive principles of state policy, and fundamental duties are all correlative to each other. They are all correlative to each other. Okay? So this is what is broadly meant by it. This is something that we must know, and this is how we will largely execute the matter. We will largely execute this in a context. Okay? So this is something we must know, this is something that we've understood, and this is something that we would be looking into. Okay? So that is that, and that is exactly how it should be done. Right? Correlation sorted, no problems at all. So we've covered origin, we've covered obligations, and we've covered correlation, right? Now, once we've understood this, we will now get into the technical details of each of these to sort of understand how this works. We're going to spend some time on classifications, we're going to spend some time on each of these, right? So let us focus on fundamental rights, okay? Now, when we focus on fundamental rights, we have to first understand the classification of fundamental rights. Then we have to understand the legal status, which we will study collectively and comparatively. And there is no identification question that is usually asked. Okay? So let's look at the classification of fundamental rights. So first, there are basically, the first way to classify fundamental rights are rights which are available only for citizens and rights which are available for citizens and foreigners. Rights which are available only for citizens and rights which are available for citizens and foreigners. This positive and negative right is different from positive and negative obligations. They mean two very different things. So rights which are available only for citizens, we largely call them positive rights, and rights which are available for everybody, we largely call them negative rights. If you remember our discussion on citizenship, I had referred this to you. I had told you that bare minimum rights which guarantee protection against the state, they are usually called negative rights. But rights which give certain benefits, rights which give certain methods of affirmative action, those are rights which are positive in nature, right? So therefore, please understand, Ankit, again, I told you this, that independently DPSPs have no correlation, and this is the last time, Ankit, I'm telling you, be well behaved as everybody else in class. Okay, there are more than 1,000 students. We have to maintain the decorum of the class. I said independently, but collectively, rights, directive principles, and duties, they're all correlative to each other. That's what I meant. Okay, that is why the notes are a reference point. Anyways, let's continue. So, for example, Article 14, which talks about, say, equality before law and equal protection of law. We will cover this in a fair amount of detail when we get to a detailed discussion clause by clauses. This as a right is a negative right. but say reservation articles for education and employment, which are in articles 15 and 16, these are rights which are of affirmative action, and therefore these are rights which are available only and only for citizens, because it makes sense that why will we give reservation to people who are not even Indian citizens, whether it is reservation for education or whether it is reservation for employment. Okay, so that's the first part. Then comes the second part. The second way that we recognize and we identify the kind of rights that are available. The second is rights which are available only against the state, and rights which are available against the state and private as well. And this private includes individuals as well as organizations. Now please understand what this means. This means the government cannot violate your fundamental right, and this means not only the government but even the private sector here cannot violate that specific right of yours, right? Now there are all rights, so all fundamental rights are actually available against the state, and that is why they are called negative obligations against the state. We've covered this in the previous slide. But there are only three fundamental rights. Now fundamental rights are about you and me, so it's an easy way to remember this. Fundamental rights are about you and me, so U plus M plus E. The fundamental rights pertaining to untouchability, movement and exploitation. The fundamental rights pertaining to untouchability, movement and exploitation are essentially the only rights which are available to both the state as well as the private sector. Okay, to both the state as well as the private sector. Okay, so that is something that you must understand from a rights perspective, to both the state as well as the private sector. These are the only two forms of classification, right? If you're doing classification, these are the only two forms in which fundamental rights are classified. Now, there is something else also which is slightly technical in nature. There is a third way to classify fundamental rights. Now, this is something which we only use in our explanations. You don't usually get this in the prelims exam. Please understand also why you don't get this in the prelims exam, because this is very factual and very legal in nature. So there are two kinds of rights, rights which are either self-executory in nature or rights which are non-self-executory in nature. Rights which are self-executory in nature and rights which are non-self-executory in nature. Now, what is the difference here, right? Please understand this. The difference here is a fundamental right is a self-executory right if all you need is that fundamental right. You don't need any other law supporting it. The right is enough and can be implemented or can be enforced as it is. You don't need anything else. The right in itself is substantial enough. You don't need the support, you don't need the help of any other law to do this. Like for example, your freedom rights under Article 19 Clause 1 Clause A. For example, this says 19 Clause 1 Clause A says the freedom of speech and expression. This is more than enough. I don't need a law giving me the freedom of speech and expression. This is more than enough. I don't need a law supporting it. No citizen shall be denied, first, the freedom of speech and expression, that is Article 19, Clause 1, Subclause A. I don't need the support of any other law here. I don't need the support for any other law here. Okay? It's a self-executory right. But for example, we talk about say Article 17, right? Article 17 abolishes untouchability, right? Article 17 abolishes untouchability. If you read Article 17, and I'll make you read Article 17 in the course of our class, the text of Article 17 very clearly says that untouchability is prohibited and shall be made a punishable offence in accordance with the law. It shall be made a punishable offence under law. So you can't make it a punishable offence under the Constitution. The Constitution is not what is called a criminal law. You need a dedicated criminal law to send people to jail if they practice untouchability, right? So that is why we create what is called the Prevention of Atrocities Against the SC/ST Act. Similarly, we have Articles 23 and 24. We'll cover them in detail, which refer to exploitation. So 23 is for human trafficking and 24 is for child labor. Just 23 and 24 is not going to be enough, which is why you have the Immoral Trafficking Prevention Act and you have the Prevention of Child Labor Act. Two dedicated provisions which are going to give you clear and impeccable clarity on what forms of human trafficking are allowed, what forms are not allowed, what is your legal status on prostitution, what is not your legal status on prostitution, what are the exemptions to it. Similarly, the Prevention of Child Labor Act, these are ordinary laws passed through an ordinary majority, through a simple majority, right? They will tell you child labor is prohibited, they'll give you a list of industries, they'll give you a list of businesses wherein child labor can work, they'll give you a list of businesses where child labor can't work. Okay, very clear, very concise in terms of exactly what needs to be done. Self-executory and non-self-executory. Okay, self-executory and non-self-executory. Okay, so that is that. So this is largely how fundamental rights get classified. You would look at, for example, rights which are available to citizens only and rights which are available to citizens and foreigners. You also then look at rights which are enforceable only against the state, rights which are enforceable not only against the state but also the private sector, and third, fundamental rights which are self-executory in nature and rights which are non-self-executory in nature, right? So this is the classification of fundamental rights. Okay, yes, the classification of fundamental rights. Now, once you've understood this, we can now move on to the other forms of classification, and this is actually very easy and you get a lot of questions actually from here, as far as the prelims is concerned, as far as all of these things are concerned. So let's start. When we look at directive principles, these are standard questions in the prelims exam, and I'm going to give you a trick to do this right. Okay, there are three kinds of directive principles that exist. First is Gandhian, second is socialist, and the third is liberal or intellectual. Liberal or intellectual. Liberal or intellectual. Okay, so let's understand the three and let's get this part right. Okay, so what are Gandhian directive principles? Gandhian directive principles, and we must get this part right, Gandhian directive principles are those which are, and see, there are two ways to go about this. You either memorize which are Gandhian, which are liberal, which are socialist, and your memory is going to fail you before the prelims exam. So you have to cross-check your memory with a little bit of logic, with a little bit of a trick. So what is the logic? What is the trick? Gandhian directive principles are usually either related to, and some of you may remember this, a grassroots change, or they are conventional in nature. They're either related to a grassroots change or they are conventional in nature, right? Grassroots change or they are conventional in nature. Okay, so that's the first part. Socialist, let's understand this. Socialist are those which talk about equitable distribution of resources. And whatever is not Gandhian or socialist automatically makes it liberal or intellectual. Whatever is not Gandhian or socialist makes it liberal or intellectual. This is basically the remainder. And by applying this simple technique, you will be able to identify which is a Gandhian one, which is a socialist one, which is a liberal or an intellectual one, right? So for example, let us say I have to quote a few directive principles. Let us say I am going to talk about organization of village panchayats. That is a directive principle. Now, organization of village panchayats sounds grassroots in nature. So, it is actually Gandhian in nature, right? Village panchayats. Similarly, cottage industries. Cottage industries are grassroots in nature. So, again, Gandhian for that matter, right? Gandhian in nature. Gandhian in nature, right? For example, you will have a directive principle which will say that we should organize agriculture or animal husbandry. Again, grassroots in nature. So Gandhian in nature. Animal husbandry or agriculture for that matter, very Gandhian in nature. Similarly, conventional, so prevention of liquor consumptions or ban or beef ban, again Gandhian in nature. So our directive principles do talk about beef ban. They do also talk about a liquor ban. Liquor ban is alcohol ban, right? So all of these are Gandhian in nature. But for example, one of our directive principles talk about, say, equal pay for equal work. Equal pay for equal work. Now, equal pay for equal work sounds like an equitable distribution of resources. So, if it is an equitable distribution of resources, it will be socialist in nature. For example, now let us say uniform civil code, or say protection of the environment, or let us say protection of wildlife and species. These are all liberal or intellectual because they are not Gandhian, they are not socialist, they are liberal slash intellectual. So a very simple way through which you can organize, and you don't have to memorize which is a directive principle and what kind of a directive principle is it, right? Simple enough. Gandhian, socialist and liberal slash intellectual. Okay, important enough. Now that we've understood this, we've gotten the essence of it, right? We figured out exactly what we are referring to. We shall now look at the next part. And the next part is also a very simple part. The next part is, are there any classifications for fundamental duties? The answer is a clear-cut no. We don't have any organized, conventional or any formal classifications of fundamental duties. But in the prelims exam, we often get questions which tell us the identification, right? We often get questions that come as identification of fundamental rights, identification of or identification between a directive principle of state policy and a fundamental duty. Which is a directive principle of state policy and which is a fundamental duty? Very important, very simple question that often gets asked. Now, you can either memorize all or you can apply a simple trick so that you don't have to memorize them and you will be able to solve most questions. So, let us see how this works. If it is a directive principle, right? You have to read the principle and read every line of the principle which is mentioned in the option in the prelims exam. And the first thing you have to do is ask yourself a question: who is going to implement this directive principle? Is the government going to implement it, or are the people going to implement it? Is the government going to implement it, or are the people going to implement it? Is it something that we as citizens have to do for our betterment, or is it something that the government should be doing? So if the answer is the government, then it will always be DPSP. If the answer is the people, it will always be fundamental duty. That's the first test. The second test is, you will notice that directive principles will always have very formally written vocabulary, very formal vocabulary to promote, to organize, to develop, very formal written vocabulary, right? Very formal to promote, to organize, things like these which are very governmental in relation. So formal vocabulary. So that is how also you can check whether it's a directive principle or a fundamental duty. And as far as a fundamental duty is concerned, now please understand this clearly. So a fundamental duty will therefore be implemented by the people and will either have informal vocabulary to value, to cherish, to uphold, things like that, or it will have a combination of informal and formal vocabulary. Informal and formal vocabulary, right? Informal and formal vocabulary. Clear? So these are some of the basic tricks through which you can identify which one makes sense and makes sense to what an extent, right? Now let's understand the further details of it. Let's understand the further repercussions of it. Okay, and let's see what we are essentially talking about. Let's see what we are essentially getting into. Okay, so let's figure this out. Let's get this part right. Okay, now suppose I'll give you a statement, a very simple statement. Suppose I give you, to abide by the Constitution, right? To abide by the Constitution and to respect its ideals, its aspirations, its ideals and institutions, the national flag and the national anthem. I'll repeat the fundamental duty again. Or let's say I'll repeat, sorry, I've already given you the answer, so I'll give you another one. If I give you a statement, to cherish and follow the noble ideals which inspired our national struggle for freedom. To cherish and follow the noble ideals that inspired our freedom struggle. The first question is, who will implement it? How will the government implement the ideologies of the freedom struggle, right? And second, look at the words: cherish, follow, combination of say formal and informal, therefore fundamental duty. Therefore fundamental duty, right? Similarly, to value and preserve. See, to value and preserve. Now this may sound very confusing. To value and preserve, okay, the rich heritage of our composite culture. To value and preserve the rich heritage of our composite culture. How will the government value anything? It's an informal word, right? And rich heritage, composite culture sounds like something that we should be doing. So it's a fundamental duty. So it is a fundamental duty, right? Very clear, right? Now, if I give you another one, to protect every monument or state, any monument or object of national importance. To protect any monument to protect any monument or object of national importance, right? Now, protect is a very strong word. You and I can't protect, right? You and I can't protect. So therefore, it is going to be the government. You are not going to go, clean the walls of the Taj Mahal if there is dirt on it, right? The government is going to do so. So it is a directive principle to promote international peace and security. You will not go solve the Afghan crisis, the government will. So it is a directive principle, right? Separation of the judiciary from the executive. Separation of the judiciary from the executive. You want to make sure that we have enough judges so that DMs don't have to be lower judges in the districts in the country. You can't do this. It is the government who will have to recruit enough judges. So separation of judiciary from the executive is also a directive principle of state policy. Is also a directive principle of state policy, right? A very simple trick. You will never ever go wrong with this specific trick, no matter what it takes. You will never go wrong with this. So read the statement carefully, ask yourself who's going to implement it, and then find for the adjectives. Find for the adjectives. Protection of environment and safeguarding forests. Sounds like protecting. Directive principles. Protection of the environment and safeguarding forests and wildlife. DPSP. But there is another line which says protect and improve natural environment and have a compassion for living creatures. And have a compassion for living creatures. Now, compassion for living creatures, you and I are going to have compassion, right? Government is a non-living entity. How will the government have any compassion? So that is why compassion for living creatures makes it automatically a fundamental duty. So read the whole statement. In the whole statement, you will always find the answer. You never have to memorize it. You never have to get into the technical details of it, right? So this is how it is to be done. These are your broad classifications. Okay, these are your broad classifications. Okay, broad classifications. Broad classifications. Okay, right? Anshul, I'm going to come to that. Just hold on. I haven't even discussed the legal status, so I'll not wait for your time. Okay, clear? All right, done. Very good. Liberal DPSP. Very good, Vanshika. Excellent. Excellent. Okay? 1 hour is up. You can take a 5-minute break and then we'll get into the technicalities, the legal status, the amenability, and the classification of rights, constitutional right, legal right, and so on and so forth. Right? So, we'll cover that up in 5 minutes, so you can take a 5-minute break. We call it as a negative right, Surbit, so that we can signify that this is the bare minimum protection that the state gives to anybody who's living in the country. And Shravan Kumar. Um, when we say it's a negative obligation on the state, it means that the government cannot violate these rights no matter what. Okay? Now, let's come to the legal status and we'll come to the amenability. So, when we try and understand the legal status of whether it's a right, directive, principle, or a fundamental duty comprises of two very specific components. One of them is amenability, and the second legal status is enforceability, right? And both of them have very clear definitions. Now, when we look at amenability, what we are referring to is, can they be changed? Yes, if they can be changed, then how can they be changed, right? So, fundamental rights, directive principles of state policy, and fundamental duties, all of the three can be changed. They can all be changed. I'm not getting into the extent to which they can be changed, and that's largely because we will discuss this in the context of basic structure. But can they be changed? Yes, absolutely. And how can they be changed? All of them will require a constitutional amendment under Article 368 without state ratification. Without state ratification. They will all be changed as a constitutional amendment under Article 368 without state ratification. All right. Now, this means it requires a special majority too, as we understand this. Now, why do we use this? Because if you remember, we had discussed the types of majorities and the applications of majorities in our earlier classes. I had very clearly mentioned that if it is a change to the constitution and it is not defined as to what kind of procedure would it require, usually the default majority is special majority 2. And the default majority for any other law is a simple majority, right? Now, the constitution nowhere mentions that these are not going to be considered constitutional amendments, nor does the constitution mention that this is going to require state ratification, which means we are going to assume that this is going to require a constitutional amendment under Article 368 but without state ratification. So all of the three can be removed, all of the three can be amended in the same way as each other, which is a constitutional amendment under Article 368 as a constitutional amendment under Article 368. Now we come to legal status, and I'd like you to keep in mind, we come to enforceability, right? Now I'd like you to keep in mind as far as our preamble discussion is concerned. So when we talk about enforceability, which means we have to implement them, we have to enforce them, we have to execute them, right? Now, enforceability will happen either by the legislature or by the executive or by the judiciary, right? Now let us talk about fundamental rights. Can fundamental rights be enforceable by the legislature? Yes. Can you make a law on it if it needs to be made a law upon? Yes. Can the executive pass an order upholding a fundamental right? Absolutely yes. Can you go to court, right, if a fundamental right is violated? Yes. Can you go to court if a fundamental right is violated? Yes. Can you take the government to court if the government is violating your fundamental right? Yes. Can you challenge a law in court if the law is violating a fundamental right? Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. Okay. So, fundamental rights are enforceable by the legislature, by the executive, and by the judiciary. And enforceability by the judiciary is also called justiciability. Is also called justiciability. So, are fundamental rights justiciable in nature? Yes, they are absolutely justiciable in nature. No problem at all. Okay, that is what is meant by fundamental rights. Okay, and that is what is meant by the enforceability status of fundamental rights. Okay, now let's come to directive principles of state policy. Please understand this as clearly as possible, right? Now, can the legislature make a law on a directive principle if they want to? Yes. That is why you wrote them in the constitution in the first place. Can the executive make a scheme or make an order on a directive principle? Absolutely yes. Absolutely. Can you take the government to court? Can you take the government to court if the government is not implementing a directive principle? Or if the government is doing something which only violates a directive principle? The answer is a no. You can't. Can the court give a judgment only on the basis of a directive principle? No. But can the court give a judgment on other things which are enforceable and directive principle? Yes. But only on directive principle? Absolutely no. No, you can't. There's absolutely no possibility. Right? Clear on this? Now, what about fundamental duties? Can the legislature, if they want, make a law on fundamental duties? See, the constitution is completely silent on this. But if they want to, can they make a law? Yes, absolutely. They can make any law they want to. Whether it's on a fundamental duty or not is irrelevant. Can they make a law? Yes, as long as it's not violating fundamental rights, you are fine. You are absolutely okay. So, this actually becomes a question mark because it's not clearly defined. Similarly, it is also a question mark for the executive. Can you generally make a law on a fundamental, an order or a scheme on a fundamental duty? Yes, you can. Should you not is a different story altogether. I'm going to come to that in just a bit, right? And if a citizen is not implementing a fundamental duty, can the government take the citizen to court? No. Can another citizen take a fellow citizen to court if they are not following a fundamental duty? Absolutely no. Now let's look at some